Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, Ethereum is now at 3K, and I know you're probably thinking, you just did a video on this yesterday, so why are we talking about it again? Well, yesterday, the video that we talked about was on ETH, but it was focused on its Bitcoin valuation. Now, again, if you're new, I think it's important to value cryptocurrencies on their Bitcoin pairs, because if you're going to go buy a cryptocurrency, you want to make sure that it's not underperforming a lower risk cryptocurrency. And if you were to look at, say, quarterly returns for ETH Bitcoin, it's now red 6 quarters in a row, and it's also been red 8 out of the last 10 quarters. So this has been something, and you might say, well, this is all good now. Why didn't you tell? We've been talking about this for 2.5 years, right? We've been talking about this for 2.5 years, that ETH was going to be bleeding against Bitcoin, and it's going to be going down probably until we hit around that 0.03 to 0.04 range. So we did a whole video on ETH Bitcoin yesterday. So you can go look at that to understand why I think ETH Bitcoin is going to go down even more. But how does that affect its USD pair? And that, I think, is obviously what a lot of people are interested in. And so all we can do, first of all, there's no way to know completely. I will say that if ETH goes up from here, it would only be due to Bitcoin going up a lot more, right? So if ETH goes up, ETH Bitcoin is probably going to keep going down. If Bitcoin goes sideways, ETH Bitcoin is going to keep going down, in my opinion. And if Bitcoin goes down, ETH Bitcoin probably goes down. Because Bitcoin has been doing all sorts of things since 2022 began, and in 8 of 10 quarters, ETH Bitcoin has gone down. Whether Bitcoin went up, down, or sideways, ETH Bitcoin generally went down. The only time it didn't was right around the merge. But other than that, it's been basically down only for ETH Bitcoin. And then before you know it, it's down, 40-something% off the high, all while everyone's saying it's holding up well. So how does that affect I keep saying it's a USD video, and I keep just talking about the Bitcoin valuation. Old habits die hard. So when you think about ETH USD, what is the most, what could it do based on what it's historically done? Well, in order to understand that, we have to go to the ETH Bitcoin valuation. So if you were to overlay ETH Bitcoin onto this chart, you will see that there are 2 prior times where ETH Bitcoin broke down, which is exactly what it's doing right now, okay? So it broke down right here in 2016. It broke down right here in 2019. And it broke down here in 2024. You see that? Pretty clearly. 3 cases where ETH Bitcoin broke support. Also, 3 cases where the whole setup was very similar, right? If you don't know what I mean, take a look at this. You get a peak, you get a lower high. In between these 2 peaks, you set your low. Same thing. Peak, lower high. Between these 2 peaks, you set your low. That's where it eventually breaks, right? That's where it eventually breaks right here. So you can clearly see it's playing out the same way. High, set the low, lower high, eventually it breaks. Now, what happened previously when it broke, as measured from the high? Well, as measured from the high in 2019, ETH USD, not including the pandemic, went down about 60 to 70%. I don't know exactly. I mean, if you take it from the wick here, is about a 70% drop. About a 70% drop. If you look at the prior cycle, from when it broke support, it dropped around 50%. Right? You see that? As measured from this wick high over here, from June, in fact, it was also about a 70% drop, as measured from that local high. So you have 2 cases where ETH Bitcoin broke down, And as measured from those local highs, it dropped anywhere between 50 to 70%, depending on how you want to measure it, right? Depending on how you want to measure it. You could make the case that ETH Bitcoin actually broke down right here, right here in June of 2016. And this was just a sort of a dead cat bounce. And so why not measure it from that wick? And if you do that, it dropped 70%. ETH also dropped 70% here. So you have two cases where ETH Bitcoin broke down and two cases where ETH USD dropped 70%. What's fascinating is in one of these cases, even though ETH USD dropped 70%, Bitcoin went up actually in 2016, right? So if you were to overlay Bitcoin USD here, while ETH USD was going down, Bitcoin was actually going up right here. And then you have another example in 2019 where ETH USD was going down, and so too was Bitcoin. So my point is, I don't think it matters what Bitcoin does. I think ETH Bitcoin is going to go down, and I think that ETH USD is still facing some headwinds here, especially following potential rejection of the spot ETF. Now, again, I don't really think that's going to have I think everyone's going to blame that, but I don't really think it is the impact. I think the impact that people are going to feel is just from tighter monetary policy. They're going to blame it on the spot ETF, and they're going to capitulate potentially into that. But I do think that looser monetary policy might arrive sometime later this summer, in which case ETH Bitcoin might bottom. A lot of times after it breaks support, it bottoms within 2 to 3 months, and so that would put it out sometime this summer. But in terms of this 70% drop, let's say 50 to 70% drop, could it play out? And again, it's just, I know people try to make this personal, and anytime I do these videos, they say all sorts of things on Twitter, but it's just, this is what happened, right? This is what happened the last two times ETH Bitcoin broke down. Could it happen again? It's possible. If it doesn't happen again and it goes up, it's only because Bitcoin went up a lot. It's not because ETH was outperforming it, okay? Let's do away with the notion that ETH outperforms Bitcoin in a bull market. It outperforms Bitcoin in a QE bull market when the Fed is lowering rates and going to QE. But in a QT bull market, quantitative tightening bull market, let me just show it on the chart because I know not everyone watches all the other videos. So you have quantitative tightening where ETH Bitcoin goes down, and you have quantitative easing where ETH Bitcoin goes up. So a lot of people have been saying, well, in a bull market, ETH outperforms Bitcoin, but only in a QE bull market, right? In QT bull market, which is what we've been in, while ETH goes up, ETH Bitcoin goes down. So what would it look like, if ETH USD were to play out like the last cycle, okay? And we've talked about this a lot, right? We actually, one of the last videos we did on Ethereum, Dubious speculation, in fact, about a month or so ago, back at around 3,500, you can see Bitcoin was at near 69K. We talked about this wedge pattern, right? And now we're about, $400 lower, right? So yes, I still think this is potentially playing out. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, this wedge pattern essentially looks something like this from the last cycle, where you have higher lows and slightly higher highs, but the higher lows are going up quicker. Like the angle of attack on the higher lows is more rapid than the higher highs, right? You see that? And then eventually you break above it. Let me remove the bull mark square pen, right? Eventually you break above it and get everyone excited, only for it to fall back through the wedge. You see that? And when it fell, the weakness showed up exactly when ETH Bitcoin broke down. ETH Bitcoin broke down right here. And that is when ETH USD began its journey back through this wedge that it had been holding as support, right? And you can see it really clearly on this chart if you look at it like this, right? You have a low, a higher low, and then a final higher low before you break out of the wedge, and then you get your top. Everyone FOMOs into it because they think ETH outperforms Bitcoin in a bull market, and then they realize, oh crap, it only does that in a QE bull market, and guess what? We're still not back to QE yet. And then it fell back through the wedge. You see? It fell back through the wedge that it spent a long time sort of building out of. And this breakdown right here occurred when ETH Bitcoin broke down. That's when ETH USD became weak. And that's what I think the issue is. I think there's so many people that are so like, they've been so bullish on ETH USD because of all the whatever fundamentals, deflationary, tokenomics, the merge, the proof of stake, all that stuff. Again, long term, I think it is bullish. In the short term, I think it's still tighter monetary policy, and that stuff is more subject to regulatory pressures than Bitcoin is. And so if it plays out like this, then it just means falling back into the summer months, falling back into that wedge. Now look at it over here. It's the same thing. But the reason why I've gotten so much flack for it this cycle, last cycle I started my channel, you know, right around here, because I saw ETH Bitcoin had bottomed out. The first two videos on my channel are about Ethereum and about the undervaluation of the ETH Bitcoin pair. But it was after it had already bottomed. It was in like August. It was like in September of 2019, after ETH Bitcoin had already bottomed. This, to me, is the same thing as this. It's the same thing, right? I mean, again, you have the angle of attack on the higher lows is more steep than the higher highs. And you have this situation where you have sort of these three tags of the trend line. 1, 2, and 3. And then you break out of the wedge and you set your high right as ETH Bitcoin breaks down. It's the same thing. Look at ETH Bitcoin. And let me switch to a log chart. So ETH Bitcoin broke down right here, and that is where ETH USD topped out. Over here, ETH Bitcoin broke down right here, and that is where ETH USD topped out, right? It's the same thing. So if that's the same, why won't it just fall back into the wedge, right? So falling back into the wedge would put it, you know, around in the low 2000s, okay? In the low 2000s. Now, I know what you're thinking. What percent drawdown is that? Well, from the high, that's only about a 46% drop, okay? Now, remember, in one of these cases, after ETH Bitcoin broke down, it was only about a 50% drop. But as measured from the local high from just a few months before, when really ETH Bitcoin broke down below this, it was 70%. And so, again, if you take it at 70%, which is what happened the last two times as measured from the local high, if you take 70%, it puts ETH USD at $1,200. Right? That sounds crazy, I know, but the logarithmic regression trend line is right at around $1,200 right now. So I can't tell you that it's impossible for that to happen. In fact, I think there's a decent chance it does happen. But again, it is a long process. And you might argue, like, why is this wedge the same as this other one, right? I mean, they took place on completely different time frames, right? So why are they the same? Why are they structurally the same? And I think that this wedge here is a larger version of this one because this rate hiking cycle has been a larger version of the last one compared to the last one, right? So the last rate hiking cycle was just this, but this rate hiking cycle is this, right? It's a lot more. And so I think that's the reason why this whole move by ETH has been taking place over a longer period of time, because the rate hikes have taken place. You know, they've been more aggressive, they've gone higher for longer. So you can see it's just a bigger version of what we saw before. If you look at the time frames here, there's actually some similarities, right? The first move here is about 8 weeks between these tags of the trend line, and then the second one was 12 weeks, and then the last one was about 12 weeks, right? So it was 8, 12, and 12. So the second and third one was 50% more than the first. Now, if you look over here, the first tag of this trend line to here is about 22 weeks. I mean, again, it's going to depend on where exactly you measure it, maybe 21 weeks. But if you take that, right, if you take that out to the next tag of the trend line right here, it's about 42 weeks, about double, in fact. If you take it here, it's about 41. And again, I mean, one of the issues is that it was on this trend line for a long time. So it really depends on where you measure it from. But in general, you can see that it was a lot longer, right? I mean, the first tag of the trend line over here to the second was, this was only 8 weeks, and the second one was 50% longer. Maybe if you just take this from here to the first tag of the trend line, it's about 21 weeks or so. And then if you measure it from when it leaves the trend line here to when it tags it again, it's about 32 weeks. And again, if you do it one more time from when it leaves the trend line right here, 32 weeks out, puts you right at the end of that wedge, which coincidentally is in June. The beginning of June, potentially right after the spot ETF is rejected. Potentially also right around the time that looser monetary policy arrives, just as ETH USD is capitulating back down to this wedge. But again, ETH USD last cycle did not bottom at that wedge. It consolidated there for a month or two, right? But it still went down. It still went down after that. So you could see an example where it falls back into the wedge, consolidates in the 2000s for a while, and then goes down from there into the lower logarithmic regression trend line. So I do think this stuff is important. I know it's easy to look at this stuff and say it doesn't matter and roll your eyes and whatever. But if you've been following along with ETH Bitcoin, you know that the only reason ETH has gone up is because Bitcoin has gone up. And you still would have been better off with Bitcoin. And I'm not a Bitcoin maxi. I don't care what you guys say. I just think that when you're in this phase of the cycle, Bitcoin is a better play. And ETH is going to go down more, I think, than on its Bitcoin pair. I think it is going to go down more on its Bitcoin pair. And I know there's a lot of people that think it's already bottomed, but they've been calling the bottom on it for the last 2.5 years. So maybe they're right now, but I don't see it. To me, it just looks like the same thing. 1, 2, and 3, right at that bull mark support band on the last one. And then the same thing here. 1, 2, and 3. And if you overlay the logarithmic regression rainbow on this chart, right, if you look at ETH USD and you overlay the regression rainbow, you will see, in fact, that in 2019, when it topped out as ETH Bitcoin broke down, it topped out in the yellow logarithmic regression trend line, which is exactly where it just found a potential lower top or a lower high. A lower high compared to this over here, just like this high was a lower high compared to that one. And then the next phase where it actually goes up a lot more, I think only occurs after the ETH USD breakdown because ETH Bitcoin has collapsed. That is the key thing that I think a lot of people are overlooking. They're not looking at the Bitcoin pair. They're just looking at ETH USD. But in reality, the last 2 times that ETH Bitcoin broke down, ETH USD went down a lot. In fact, about 50 to 70%. So if it goes down 50%, it puts it at 2K. If it goes down 70%, it puts it at 1,200, which again is not impossible. In fact, if you look at the last 2 times that ETH Bitcoin broke down, it broke down here and here. And both of those times it broke down, ETH USD basically was just down only until it hit the lower part of the regression band. Down only until it hit the lower part of the regression band. It's in the move, right? I mean, it looks like it's making the move. It's just really slow, but it's happening potentially. But because it's going on so slow, it's giving everyone plenty of time to think about it and argue about it. But I don't know that this is any different. I think it could be very well the same thing. And again, we talked about this scenario back over here in this dubious speculation video that we did about a month or 2 ago. After it had put in this local top at around 4K, it was at 3,500. We said it's likely going to keep on bleeding down. and go into this wedge by June, and now it's $500 lower. It went $500 lower after that. Now it's at around 3K. And the next step is to eventually break 3K and then go down below that to maybe 2K. So those are my views. I know a lot of people are definitely in disagreement on this. And again, if I'm wrong about ETH USD, I think it's only if Bitcoin goes up a lot. And then it can drag ETH with it because it can drag everything with it. But even then, I don't even think it's a sure thing, because over here, ETH USD dropped 50% even while Bitcoin was going up when ETH Bitcoin broke down. So there exists a scenario where it just doesn't matter what Bitcoin does. ETH USD goes down. Which I know sounds crazy, but I remember this. I remember when this happened, because I was very bullish on ETH back then, and then it went all the way back down to the range lows. If you notice, what it does is ETH sets a low, and then eventually it retests that low, right? I mean, I don't know why it does that all the time, but it does seem to do that, and so I do wonder if that's sort of going to be the case for the third time, and if it does happen, then I want people to be prepared for that outcome. So again, that'll wrap it up for the video. I do think Ethereum could very well play out like it historically has, and I think that ETH Bitcoin breaking down is a very bad omen for the altcoin market, especially on their Bitcoin pairs. And I think we're going to see all this play out here over the next couple of months or so. And I mean, if it does go to low regression band, it could take longer than a couple of months, right? I mean, this one here took from June until December, right? I mean, if this is the local top, it's March, so it could take quite a while. But I think it'll take only a couple months potentially for it to get back into that wedge around the low 2000s or so. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the video, thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.